Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending our DC contracts training. We are going to get started because we have a lot to cover. My name is Virginia Gargoff, and I am the principal broker for Keller Williams Capital Properties. I have been licensed since 2004. I was dual career for a few agents and then full-time agent. I joined a team and I was doing most of the listings for that team. And then about 5 years ago, I started my leadership journey, and now I am the principal broker for DC, Maryland, and Virginia for Keller Williams Capital Properties. So thank you everybody for joining. We are going to go through the DC contract, and we're going to be looking at what are the things that are important for you to know about the contract, what are the addendums, right? And what are the best practices as you complete the contract. This is supposed to be interactive, so please unmute yourself and ask questions as we go, or use the chat in the right side. You will be more than happy to ask your questions there. Angel is going to be monitoring our chat, so if there are many questions, then we're going to probably stop and go through the questions and then keep going. Before we get started, anybody has anything pressing that you would want to make sure that we cover today?
Virginia,
Yes?
thanks for this. Just simply going over some of the condo aspects of the contracts, please.
Okay. The condominium addendum?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, what else?
Will we be going over TAPA today?
Are we going to go over what?
TAPA, Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act.
We could. I don't think we have enough time. That's probably a class in itself, but we can touch on it and we can also schedule a follow-up class for sure. Okay, great. All right. So as we think about the DC contract, right, the first thing that we have to think about is, are we working with a buyer that is interested in purchasing a property in DC? So the first screen that I'm going to share is kind of like our Bright MLS screen. And the reason why it's important to share this screen is because the starting point to write an offer will be what property are we looking into, right? So I just pulled a few properties in Washington, D.C., and when you go into Bright MLS, let's say that you show this listing and you're going to have to need some information that is actually in the listing to be able to work on your contract. So as you get started, the three pieces that need to take place before you actually write an offer, there are three components, right? First, you need to have a buyer agency agreement already signed, right? So if you find yourself writing an offer and you say, oh, by the way, I'm going to include my buyer agency agreement, that's not best practice. Your buyer agency agreement should have already been signed by then. The second piece is this information that you're going to be pulling from Bright. For example, you need the tax ID number. There are some critical pieces of data that you're going to be pulling from Bright MLS. And then the third component is you're going to need the seller disclosures. So there are some exceptions as to when somebody is actually required to provide disclosures. If you are a personal representative of a state, if you're an attorney, there are certain conditions in which the document called seller disclosures is not required. However, if somebody says, I am exempt from disclosures, that does not mean the whole disclosure package, okay? That means one document that is called the seller disclosures. So there are other documents that still need to be part of the disclosures. So as a best practice, as you start writing a contract, think about those three things. Buyer agency must already be signed. You need to pull some data from Bright MLS, and you need your seller's disclosures to be able to start writing the offer. A lot of times the seller disclosures are already uploaded into Bright MLS and they will show here in the top. There will be an icon called documents. In this case, the disclosures are not in this property, but if there were, they would be listed here in the top, okay? If for some reason the disclosures are not listed, you need to reach out to the listing agent and say, hey, I have a client that is interested in writing out an offer. can you please send me the disclosures? Okay. You need to be familiar with what is included in the disclosure package, because it is your job. If the seller does not include something, you have two options. Either you include it as part of your contract, or you tell the seller, I'm submitting, or the listing agent, I'm submitting an offer, but I just noticed the disclosure package is not complete. You're missing, like Rodrigo was saying before, you're missing, for example, the condo resale document, right? Or the condominium addendum. So you need to make sure that they provide that, because there is critical information in that disclosure that if you don't have it, you could be putting your client at risk. So for example, in the condo addendum, they are going to be talking about how much is the condo fee, if there is a special assessment and things like that. If the listing agent and the seller forgot to include that, and you also forget, then your client is not going to have some critical information about the condominium, right? So sometimes the disclosure package is not complete. Make sure that you have your checklist and that you know exactly what is supposed to be part of that disclosure package and that you include it. So with this data, I'm just going to pull the GCAR contract. And can everybody see now the GCAR contract on my screen? Perfect. Okay.
Yes.
So, great, thank you. All right, so we're going to use the standard GCAR contract, right, to be able to write our offer. And this is the main document. And as we know, this main document is going to have other attachments. We're going to have, if the buyer wants to do a home inspection, we're going to have a home inspection addendum. If they want to finance the property and have a financing contingency or an appraisal contingency, we're going to include those additional documents to this contract. Okay. So the sales contract is dated on, and you're going to put the date that you write the offer. So in this case, we're writing our offer today, right? And then the contract is written between a buyer and a seller. So you have 2 spaces to put 2 buyers' names, and you have 2 spaces for 2 sellers' names. Okay. If you only have 1, you only include 1. If you have more than 2, then you can either include them at the end, or you can write a general addendum saying buyer and seller understand that the sellers are the following individuals, right? So the standard contract gives you a space for 2, but if you have more people, you need to make sure that you add them. One thing that happens all the time is that you write the names wrong. You say, for example, Virginia Gargoff, but then when you go and look at the license or the passport, that person has a different name or a different last name or initial. So the best practice is you go to your clients and you ask, how would you want your name to be written in the contract? Okay. If you ask your clients, how would you like your name to be written in the contract, then the document will be correct from the get-go. If you don't do that at the 11th hour, 2 days before closing, the title company is going to say, well, the names are wrong, and you're going to have to correct the contract or write an addendum again on day 28th, right? So it's better to do it correct from the beginning. For the seller, you have 2 options, right? You can either go to the tax record, and I'm going to go back to Bright MLS, and then you see here on tax ID, there is a link. This is a live link. If you click on that link, it's going to take you to the property, right? And here it says the owner is Howard Road Community Partners, LLC. So you can copy this, right? And then you can paste it in your contract as the seller, right? Or you can ask the listing agent if the disclosures have a different name. And again, this is really important, especially as we have more scams and people trying to falsify documents right out there. You need to cross-reference this information if it's not the same. If the owner in the tax record says that is Howard Road Community Partners, but then either the disclosures or the listing agent tells you that the seller is Virginia Gargoff, you have to say, hey, wait a second, there is a discrepancy here, right? And that discrepancy, the sooner that you catch it, the better. Why? Because if there is something wrong with the title, you need to uncover that sooner rather than later. So always cross-reference what you see here in the tax record with the disclosures or what the listing agent is telling you as the name of the owner of the property. If there is no discrepancy, great. You put your seller's information here and you put your buyer here. I'm going to use Angel as an example. Okay. So because we are working as buyers, we're going to put here the listing company, right? Let's say that is Long & Foster or Compass. So you put the listing company in there, and then you put yourself as the buyer's agent. Remember that the buyer agent is called the selling company, and the listing agent is called the listing company, right? So you're going to put your brokerage here, and then you're going to click that brokerage is representing the buyer. Why do they give you the option of representing the seller under the selling company? Because you have what is called sub-agency, okay? So if you don't have a buyer agency agreement signed, you're actually not working for the buyer, right? You're a sub-agent of the seller. So you have to be very careful and always check that you're representing the buyer, okay? Then you have the second portion of this page where you're going to be talking about the real property, right? So again, I'm just going to go back and copy the property address and I'm going to paste it here, right? And you're going to put that the property is in Washington, D.C. So you complete all these fields. And the zip code is 20020. And then so you put that here. And then it's asking you if it's a condominium, what is the name of the project, if it has parking, and if it has storage, what are the parking and the storage numbers, okay? Be really careful. We had a lawsuit last year in which a buyer thought that she was buying a property that included parking, and we were on the listing side, and we did not list the parking on the listing, and she thought the property included parking, but her agent failed to include a parking space into this field. So the contract did not have any parking spaces here, and it did not have any storage units here. And then when the title company did the title search, they did not find any parking that conveyed with the property. So the property was transacted without a parking space. And when the buyer goes into the property, she says, "Where is my parking?" And they were like, "There is no parking." And then there was a big problem with that transaction. So as the buyer's agent, you need to make sure that, again, you cross-reference the information. If the property doesn't say anything about parking and you have a question, ask the listing agent. Also, you can ask, where can I find information about this parking space conveying with the property? If for some reason, and it happens a lot, the listing agent is going to say, "Yeah, there is a parking, but I don't remember the number." You could put TBD, right? You could say the parking space, we don't know the number, but then you have to go back and make sure that you find that parking space, right? Again, the more complete that the contract is, the more that you are protecting your client. So try not to leave any blank spaces. Don't leave anything for interpretation.
Virginia, that should also be in the condo resale disclosure, right?
Yes, a lot of times it's there.
But a lot of times it's not. So
a lot of times it's not. Yeah. And
Virginia.
remember, there are two ways in which a parking space could be conveyed. One is as a common element and is attached to the tax record of the condominium, or as a separate kind of like piece of real estate, right? So you need to understand if it conveys with the unit or if it does not convey with the unit. And the title company needs to know because the process is different.
Virginia, this is Chris with Angela. This is not Angela's voice. I'm curious, how did that situation end with the parking space and that particular client or that particular buyer?
Sorry, what was the question?
How was that resolved?
Well,
the lawsuit.
That's a very good question. So the buyer sued the condominium association, the seller, her agent, and us as the listing agent. So she sued everybody, and she said, somebody's going to pay for this parking. and everybody had to settle. We did what is called a joint settlement, and everybody contributed a portion towards having her. She was lucky that actually there was a parking space for sale, because the other thing that could have happened is that there was actually no parking available in the building, right? So she got lucky that there was a parking space for sale, and the parties agreed to settle, and the settlement basically covered the parking space. And again, all this can be avoided by either doing two things: going deep in asking the right questions, and clarifying when something is not 100% clear. So if you see that the name is different, if you see in the description parking conveys, but there is no information on the parking, that's your yellow flag, right? That's when you stop and you say, hey, wait a second, I need to know more about this, right? Don't you kind of like let it go and be like, yeah, we'll come back to it. Right now and right here and right now is the best time to address it. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. The other piece of information that you're going to need, and again, I'm still in that tax record page, which is attached to Bright MLS. So the only thing that you have to do is click on that link. Okay. The other piece of information, you're going to need the tax ID. And here it is under geographic information. You see the tax ID, right? And you basically just copy that, and then you're going to put it here where it says tax account, okay? And for those of you that remember your pre-licensing, when you look at the lot and the block and a square, the second number goes first, right? That's how we will study it and remember. And the block goes second, okay? So you literally just copy from there and put it there. If you know the subdivision, you include it. If you don't know the subdivision or you're not clear, you can leave that section blank. This is not going to create problems for you. If you put the wrong subdivision, most likely it's going to be okay. As a rule of thumb, you can just go to the legal subdivision in the listing, right? Again, sometimes the subdivision is listed differently. Just go with the legal subdivision, okay? So this is Berry Farms. And then you put it here, and then you have it there, okay? And then it's going to ask you, because as we know, GCAR covers DC and Montgomery County. So you need to make sure that when you are working on the jurisdictional addendums, that you actually have the one for the District of Columbia. So you click on that one, okay? The jurisdictional addendum is one of those disclosures that the seller has to provide. And if they don't, make sure that either you include it in your offer and say, hey, you missed the jurisdictional addendum. So you include it as a blank document and don't have your client sign any blank documents. You just include the document and say, hey, when your seller answers to my offer, they need to complete this because you didn't include it in your disclosure package, right? So make sure that is in there. All right, the next section is the price and the financing. So the sales price, that's what we're going to put, how much we're offering for the property. And obviously this is a negotiation. You're going to be discussing that with your client. But in this case, this property is listed for $609. So assuming that we're going to be paying full price, don't put $2 signs. You offer the $609. It's very picky. Okay, so down payment. For the down payment, you have two options. You can put a dollar amount or you can put a percentage. Don't put both, okay? That's why there is an or here. It's either or. So if your client says, I want to put $50,000, you put it in here. If they say, I want to put 5% down, you put it in here, right? So whatever the amount is going to be, as a best practice, if you use percentages for everything that is listed underneath, okay? Or if you put dollar amounts, then you put dollar amounts for everything, okay? So the down payment, and then you have the financing. For those of you that like math, the down payment and the financing need to add to 100%. We have seen many contracts in which does not add up, and it has to add up to 100%. So if you only have one first trust, and you had said 5% for the down payment, then here would be 95, right? We're not using second trust as much as we used to do like 15 years ago. That was kind of like a second loan, right? But if there was, this would have been looking like maybe 80% here and 15% here, right? That's what it would look like. But these days we're not seeing many of those. So most likely you're only going to have one amount of like a primary loan, and then your down payment. So that will add to 100%. And again, total financing, this is the 95%, right? If you have more than one thing completed here, then all this will add to the 90%. Financing contingency, are you going to add a financing contingency to the contract? And you could be financing a property and not have a financing contingency, right? So when we are in a seller's market, a lot of times we see offers where the buyer is actually financing the property, but they don't have a financing contingency. So in this case, if you're going to say yes or no, you will add it here. And then you're going to say what kind of financing it is, if it's conventional, VA, FHA, or other. People underestimate the importance of this field. And because I sit on the brokerage side, I see a lot of problems with this section. People say conventional. When you have a financing contingency, and we're going to see the financing contingency later on, when your contingency only protects you for a specified financing, okay? And some people have never heard that term. A specified financing is what you actually specified in the contract that was going to weigh the way you finance the property. If you have in here conventional, and then you send a denial letter for an FHA loan, the listing agent is going to say, I'm so sorry, your financing contingency does not protect you because that's not a specified financing. The other term that you're going to hear is called alternate financing, right? So you have specified financing, which is what you specified in the contract, and then you have alternate financing. And if you send a denial letter for something that is not the specified financing, the financing contingency does not protect you, okay? So if your client is flip-flopping, I think I'm going to use conventional, but maybe FHA, but maybe conventional, and you ratify a contract, and 2 days later, they say, it's going to be FHA, then you have to write an addendum that has to be signed by the seller, in which you say, buyer and seller agree that the financing is changing from conventional to FHA, and that the financing contingency protects the buyer with an FHA financing, okay? So you're changing the specified financing from conventional to FHA. I see it happen all the time. And when we tell the buyer's agent, well, the contingency doesn't protect you because this is alternate financing, they are like, what? What do you mean? So it's really important that you understand these terms, because the buyer is trusting you as the expert. And if you don't understand the nuance between this, you're exposing your client to maybe not having a contingency that they were counting on, okay? Appraisal contingency. So this contract is contingent on appraisal or is not, right? If it's contingent, you have to include the GCAR addendum. And then the seller will or will not provide appraisers reasonable access. So since you are the one writing the contract and you are representing the buyer, you always put in here the seller will provide the appraiser reasonable access. If the seller doesn't want to provide access, then they have to change this, and your client has to approve to that change, right? They have to cross it out and they say, no, I'm not going to provide access. Let's say that the property is not safe, and they say, no, we're not going to provide access. We don't want anybody walking through the property. Then they change it to will not provide access. And you have to make sure that your client is okay with that and they sign off on that change, okay? But as a best practice, you always say the seller will provide access. Assumption. So again, remember, we are in the price and financing section. So assumption is if the buyer will assume a portion of the seller's loan, okay? Not very common, but if they do, then this is the section where you will include that, okay? Deposit. So buyer's deposit is in the amount that you decide with your buyer that you're going to put into escrow. Let's say that is $10,000. So you're going to write your $10,000 here, right? And then you're going to say this is going to be held by the escrow agent. Escrow agent normally is the title company. Some brokerages have the best practice or have the practice that they also hold escrow money on behalf of their clients. In our case, Keller Williams, we do not hold escrows. We always, as a best practice, send the money to the title company. And the reason why that is important is because the title company is a neutral party to the transaction. And there is a mechanism that they follow if there is a dispute, right, with the deposit. So it's better to have it managed by a neutral party in the transaction. And so, you talk to your broker and do what is best if you're not working with Keller Williams Capital Properties. But in our case, the escrow agent is always going to be the title company. And then here you put whether the buyer has delivered. Very rarely the buyer has already delivered the deposit to the title company when you're actually writing the contract. But let's say that you were under contract for a property, the property fell through, and the title company has $10,000, and you are like, yeah, well, let's write a contract on something else. The title company already has the money. In that case, you would use has already delivered. But if not, you're going to say will deliver the deposit within X number of days of ratification. I would say 1 day is very quick. You're going to put your buyer in a little bit of a stressful situation to send that money overnight. So normally people will say anything around 2-3 days, right? 5 days or 7 days being on the higher end of what you're going to be putting in here. But let's say that you have a client that is overseas and that they need to transfer money between their accounts, and they say, hey, give me 5 days. I need a little bit more time. Then you can put an extended period of time here. But normally I would say between 3 and 5 days is a good practice. It's your responsibility to double check and follow up with your buyer to make sure that they send the money. And again, I sit in grievance committee for GCAR. I am the broker for Keller Williams. And I see a lot of cases where the agents say, well, we're not going to send the money until we do the home inspection. That's not correct. That's not best practice. Don't do it. I know it's a pain to send the money. And then if you void because of the home inspection, your buyer has to agree to get that money back. But that is how you're writing the contract. If that is not your intention, then this is your opportunity to change this number. Let's say that you're going to be doing a home inspection in 2 days and you don't want to send the money until you get the results of that home inspection, then put 6 days here or 7 days here, right? Put whatever amount of time is realistic for you to send the money. Don't trick the other party and don't be sloppy in your transaction. Don't say, oh, I'm going to send the money in 2 days, but I never intended to send that money until I got the results of the home inspection. Don't do it, right? You don't look good as an agent. You look sloppy. You can expose your client to a lot of trouble. So whatever you're going to put it in here, you're going to make sure that that money actually is delivered to the title company within that time frame. And again, it is your job to follow up with the buyer and say, hey, just a reminder, have you sent that money? Does the title company have the money? As a word of caution, you have to tell your clients that they have to be aware of scams and phishing, right? Emails. So some people, the moment that they can, track your emails and see that you're under contract, they are going to create an email address that looks very similar to yours or to the title company, and they are going to send an email to your client saying, send the money to this account, okay? You have to tell your client when you're writing the offer to say, listen, you're not going to follow any wiring instructions that you get on a random text or on a random email or a random phone call, right? You call the title company, right? And you check the wiring instructions with them. Or some title companies like KBS and Universal Title, they have secure platforms, Qualia and some others, where they actually, it's encrypted and it's secure. And then you can do the whole transactions through that platform. And you tell your clients, only use the information that you're getting through this secure platform. But we have seen horror stories where the buyer sends $20,000 to the wrong account, right? So again, this is your job. You have to tell them, be careful about this. Don't do it if you get a text, a phone call, an email. Don't send the money to a random account. Always double check, call the title company, and that is the only way that you know that your money is protected. As a best practice in the G-Card contract, every page has a seller's initial and buyer's initial at the bottom. So sometimes people forget to initial this, and then you have to go back and get your clients to initial. So remember that in the G-Card contract, every single page has an initial section at the bottom. Okay, so make sure that those are initialed. This is more on in terms of, what happens to the deposit. So make sure that you understand the default paragraph on the contract, and we're going to look at it a little bit later. But basically, if the contract is declared void, the money is not automatically released. Both the buyer and the seller have to sign a release document, right? So when somebody calls me and they say, my client wants to void the contract, there are two documents that you need. One is a notice to void the contract, right? And you can void based on home inspection, based on appraisal, whatever it is. You have to say why you're voiding the contract. So you need two documents, the notice to void and then the release of the deposit. And in the release of the deposit, hopefully you say the whole amount of the deposit, the $10,000, goes back to the buyer. The buyer signs that, the seller signs that. They send it to the title company, and then the title company releases the funds once they receive that document, okay? And that a lot of times the seller says, I'm not going to sign, you missed your home inspection deadline, right? And that's when all the problems begin. But make sure that, that you have a clear timeline and that you're following the dates and the times, so you don't expose your client to missing deadlines, okay? Because it happens all the time. As a best practice, you can create kind of like a little timeline with your client and say, we have 3 days to send the deposit. That time frame expires on Wednesday, February 5th by 4 p.m., whatever, 6 p.m. And then you keep track of all those deadlines, okay? Funds due at settlement. So you're sending, let's say, those $10,000 in advance. The balance of the funds due at settlement from buyer and seller will be paid on or before the settlement date. Buyer and seller shall verify with settlement agent how funds due at settlement are to be paid. Most likely, it's going to be another wire transfer, the same way that you send your deposit. The same way is going to be how you're going to send the balance of the amount. The bank is going to send their portion, and then the buyer is going to send whatever money they need to send that will cover the closing cost and any additional down payment. Settlement, the parties agree that they are going to perform in accordance to the terms of the contract by the settlement date, except as otherwise provided in this contract, and buyer elects the settlement agency to conduct settlement. You have to be really careful with disclosures these days. Keller Williams has a affiliated business disclosure. Every major brokerage has one. If you have a partnership with a title company and there is some sort of business relationship with that title company, you have to disclose that to your client. So let's say that I'm representing the buyer and I am with Keller Williams, and Felicia is representing the seller and she's with Weicker. I have to disclose my affiliation with Universal Title to my client. I don't have to disclose it to Felicia or to her client, but Felicia has to disclose that she has an affiliated business to her client. So for the purpose of disclosing affiliated businesses, you only disclose it to your client, okay? That's the only party that is required to understand who you're affiliated with. So a lot of times in the contracts, you see these affiliated business agreements. It's wrong to have that in the contract, okay? And you see them all the time. That document has to be part of the buyer agency package. So, and again, the way to learn and understand this is anything that is signed between you and your client, buyer agency, affiliated business, right? All that is part of your buyer agency agreement. If it's signed by you and your client, it's part of the buyer agency or the listing agreement. If it's signed between a buyer and a seller, then it's part of the contract. Okay, that's how you know. You go to the bottom of the document and it says buyer agent or buyer agent, buyer broker and buyer. You automatically say this is a buyer agency document. That does not go into the contract. The only thing that makes it to the contract is something that the buyer and the seller have to sign. Okay. And again, we see this all the time. People send all this bunch of documents that do not belong to the contract. So another thing is we are moving away from this, but up to like 5 years ago, we would see the seller saying, well, you buyer have to close with my title company. Actually, the buyer has the right to choose the title company that they choose, okay? The seller can provide advice or a recommendation and say, hey, this title company already has all my documents. It will be great if you close with my title company. The buyer might agree to that, but again, the buyer has the right to choose the title company, right? So if you have a listing agent that is very pushy, I just had this conversation with somebody yesterday from Redfin, and they were like, well, you have to use our title company. And I responded, my agent reached out to me and she said, what do I say? And I responded to that agent saying, no, you're wrong, right? The buyer gets to choose. So no, we're not going to close with the title company that you want, because that's not how the law works. So understand your rights and your client's rights. Property maintenance and condition, except as otherwise specified herein, seller will deliver the property at settlement vacant, free and clear of trash and debris, broom clean, and in substantially the same physical condition to be determined as of the date of the offer, the date of the home inspection, or other. So again, settlement comes in and there are trash bags, it's not clean, they left food in the fridge, right? And then the listing agent is going to be like, oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, just put all that in the trash. No, right? Your client doesn't have to do that. You don't have to do that. But they are also not required to do a professional cleaning, right? So it says free and clear of trash, debris, broom clean. Broom clean is literally broom clean, right? It's not a professional cleaning. So if your buyer gets upset and they are like, this house is filthy, you can, if you want to do that, you can pay for a professional cleaning, or you can manage their expectations and say, my recommendation is that you schedule a professional cleaning before you move in. But it's important that they understand that the contract only requires broom clean, okay, and free of debris and trash.
Virginia,
So,
what is the best, your opinion, to do the walkthrough? A couple of days or the day before settlement?
I get very paranoid with the condition of the house. And if I do it the night before, I always feel that there will be that tree that fell on the house overnight. So personally, I always do them in the morning. I schedule my closings for around noon. And the reason why the noon time frame is kind of like a sweet spot is because you can do your walkthrough in the morning, you can go to closing, but the banks have had enough time to wire the funds everywhere and before the bank closes, because after 3 p.m., the title company and the bank won't release any more wires, right? So if you're scheduled your closing for 4, it might be a little tight with the money going where it has to be. So I always try to do it middle of the day and do the walkthrough right before. That's my recommendation, but you can do it however you want. Obviously, it also depends on the buyer's schedule. Some people are tempted to say, oh, don't worry, you and I go the night before and I will go right before closing because I'm such a nice agent, right? I'll do that for you. I'll see you at closing and I will go before. Don't do that. Don't do that, because you are absorbing all the liability of what can go wrong, right? Let's say that you were rushing and you did not go to the basement and the basement had flooded. Then your buyer is going to say, you were there and you didn't catch that. So you have to fix it, right? So I know that a lot of times we want to be nice for our clients, but don't take on liability that you should not be taking on. So if the client wants to go the night before, that's it. You go the night before. Or if they want to go before closing, you go before closing with them. Don't go without them.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Virginia,
Mhm.
let's say you're in the morning and you do find that the basement is flooded, okay, and your closing is at 2 p.m. How would you handle?
So you can delay closing, right? And say the property is not in the same condition. That's why that language is in there. So you say we have to delay closing because the property is not in the same condition. Or you can request money to be put into an escrow account until the repairs are done. The problem with putting money into an escrow account is that the lender, if the buyer is financing, the lender has to approve that. And depending on the lender, sometimes that can happen very quickly, and sometimes it can take time. Okay. A lot of times the lenders actually don't like that, and they are going to say, no, we're not closing. Remember, the lender also owns the house. They own 95% of the house, and you only own 5%, right? So sometimes they are going to say, no, that has to be fixed before we close. So basically you have to call the listing agent and say, hey, the house is not in the same condition. We need to figure out a path forward to fix this issue before we close. And it's unfortunate, but it happens very frequently.
Virginia,
Yes.
I would like your take on what already happened, and it taught me a lesson, but I would like to know how I should have handled. So I had a walkthrough with my clients just on the same day as we were closing. On my way to the property, I received a call from the listing agent and telling me that originally that we asked the seller to fix the stove and was the only item on to-do list for them. They said, well, you know what, the people came to fix it, but accidentally they broke. But we have the agreement with the company that in case if they won't find that piece, they will pay you $750. So I said, okay. So I shared that information with my buyers. And again, we came to a settlement. And at the end, what's happened, that piece wasn't anyway to be found because it was out of manufacturing. And I believe the company who was fixing it, they probably did know that the piece will be very hard to find. So now my clients are actually battling them to go to court. So how I should have prevented, because again, I took kind of like, okay, she called me, she knows that she's putting her foot forward, to be honest. But turned out it's not what it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and unfortunately, this happens very frequently, and it's a fine line that you have to navigate between trusting what the person is saying and trusting that they are going to do the right thing and not, right? So, when you think about checks and balances and how the money flows in a transaction, it's never a good idea, never ever, that somebody's writing a check on the side and I'm going to pay this and I'm going to send you that, right? Everything, remember, all the exchange of money has to be in the ALTA, right? So, for example, they could say, well, we need an invoice from the plumbing company or the electric company. We need an invoice from them. And the seller is going to pay this today, the day of closing, to that company, right? Let's say that the electrician says, well, I'm waiting for the part, and the part I think is going to be $750. You say, well, listen, send us an invoice. We're going to put that invoice in the ALTA. The seller is going to pay you the $750, right? And if at the end of the day, you don't deliver the part or whatever, it's between you, electric company, and the seller to figure that out. But you have to provide that service to me because the service is already paid for. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
My recommendation is that you always add a little bit of extra money because it's never going to be that amount, right? So if they say $750, I would actually ask for $1,500, right? You need to make it painful enough for the other party to take you seriously, because what is going to happen is, oh yeah, sure, I'll send you the money. Oh, well, it's just $250. Oh, well, blah, 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 right? And I'll write you a check. I will send you a check. And you're like, no. We're going to put this in the ALTA and I'm going to make it painful enough for you to take me seriously, right? So if the plumber says $500, I'm going to ask for $1,000, right? Why? because I need a buffer and because I need to make sure that you take this seriously, right? So creating that additional pressure and a little bit of pain to the seller is the way to get them to respond to you. But never agree to them sending you as the agent a check, sending the buyer a check. All the money has to be exchanged in the Alta. Everybody needs to be able to see that money changing hands. And the best practice is that is with a receipt, right? It's an invoice that was paid or money kept in escrow with the title company. And then the title company will release that money based on what was agreed. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So here at the bottom is where you say this contract is contingent upon a home inspection, or the buyer declines the opportunity to make the contract contingent on a home inspection. If you miss this and then you add a home inspection addendum, it creates a lot of trouble, right? Because the seller is going to say, well, they didn't mark this, right? I didn't notice that you had a home inspection addendum. So again, make sure that this is consistent with what you have later on. If you had a home inspection addendum and you negotiated the contract and at the end the addendum goes away, go back and change this from contingent to declined opportunity, okay? But make sure the contract is consistent. Access to the property. Seller will provide broker, buyer, inspectors representing institutions for appraisal, access to the property. This is very sensitive as well. And, you know, for those of you that have been in business for a long time, you always get that buyer, right? Like, I want to bring my mom, I want to go back to measure, blah, blah, blah. The reality is that the seller does not have to agree to have you go back to the house 10 times, right? They need to provide reasonable access, and reasonable access is if you have a home inspection addendum, you go with the home inspector, and then the appraiser goes into the house, and that's it. That's it. If I have seen cases, and that happened to me very early on in my career, that the listing agent actually removed the lockbox after the home inspection and the appraisal. He removed the lockbox. Lockbox gone, right? You don't even have the option to try to schedule another opportunity to go back. And they said, no, the seller has provided reasonable access, and we will see you at closing. And the seller has the right to do that, right? Reasonable access is not for you to go back with 5 family members and show them the backyard, unfortunately. So if you feel that your buyer is very anxious and they want to see the property, just tell them, hey, bring your measuring tape the day of the home inspection, right? That is our opportunity to spend a lot of time at the house and do whatever we want, measure, right? Take pictures, take videos, but that is your one opportunity to do it. So make sure that they understand that, because sometimes they say, well, the seller is being unreasonable. And yeah, they are, but at the end of the day, they are following the contract, and that's what the contract calls for. Inclusion exclusions, again, this is very important. This is one of the sections that people dismiss, and they're like, oh yeah, that little list of things, right? But if in that little list of things, they said the microwave does not convey, and then the day of the walkthrough, you're like, where is the microwave? Well, you actually missed the fact that they actually had said they were not going to convey the microwave, right? So make sure that you review that with your client, and that they understand what is being conveyed with the property and what is not being conveyed. As a rule of thumb, anything attached to the property is considered to convey. But for example, if they have an antique chandelier and they say the chandelier does not convey, what they have to do is replace it with a fixture, right? There has to be a light fixture in there, but it doesn't have to be the antique chandelier. They do have to disclose that the chandelier does not convey, right? Otherwise, your expectation will be that it does. Home warranty, this is whether there will be a home warranty offer with the property. This is one of those things that can always be added later on, and it can be paid by anybody, right? The listing agent, the seller, the buyer's agent, the buyer. So this is one where you have a little bit of flexibility. If you say no home warranty and then somebody decides to buy one, that's fine. It doesn't really matter if you say no and then you add it. It does matter if you say yes and then you don't add it, right? Because you have to change the contract if that is your intention. Buyer representations, the buyer will or will not occupy the property as their primary residence. This is really important for tax purposes, right? If you're going to be claiming the homestead deduction, it's really important that you put in here whether they plan to occupy or not occupy. A lot of times, buyers try to get a principal loan, right? Like, yeah, I'm going to be leaving the property, and they never intended to do that. Be very careful and try not to get in the middle of that, right? That's between the buyer and the lender. If you feel that the buyer is doing something that is not kosher, make sure that you talk to the lender and the title company and say, hey, it's not clear to me whether the buyer is going to occupy the property or not. But again, you don't want to be part of any tax evasion lawsuits. So, just you have to follow what the buyer says. And if they say yes, they get some benefits, that homestead and obviously preferential loan terms. This section where it says the selling company is or is not authorized to disclose to the listing company, seller, and any lenders the appropriate financial or credit information statement provided to the selling company by the buyer. So the good news is that now we're not getting as much of the financial information from the buyer as we used to do. For those of you that have been in the business more than 10, 15 years, we used to have a document called the financial information sheet, where the buyer would put in their assets, their income, all these things, right? And they will complete that document and send it to you. And that was a really bad idea. First, because you don't want that document sitting in your desk or anywhere. It opens you to liability. And second, the reality is that it is not your job to qualify that buyer, right? It's that the financial institution, the one providing the loan, is doing that job. So nowadays, this is not as relevant, where it says the selling company is authorized to disclose to the company the information that they have. You can say, yes, I'm authorized to disclose, but I actually don't have a lot of information other than my client has a job, right? And according to the lender, they are a solid buyer. As a rule of best practice, always channel all those questions to the lender. So if the listing agent calls you and they say, how strong is your buyer? You say, hey, actually talk to the lender that pre-qualify them. You don't have to answer that question. Why? Because you don't want to misrepresent one way or the other. And second, because you actually have no information, because the buyer has not provided any of that information to you. So if you say, it's wonderful, it's the best buyer ever, you might actually be misrepresenting, right, the information. So,
I have a question. Hi.
Yes.
This is Michael Sims. Yeah, so what about, I understand that as you don't want that information, but as the listing agent, if you have someone who says, I'm putting down 5%, I always request to see liquid assets of 5%, because that is what they're stating. And the lender, when they go there, I don't even want to tie it up if I haven't seen at least what they're supposed to bring for their closing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So as a listing agent, you do have the right to ask for proof of funds. And if you're on the buyer side, the best way to do would be, the listing agent ask for proof of funds. Can you share this information with me so I can pass it along? When you do that and you're on the buy side, ask your client to black out the bank account, all the confidential information. Again, you really do not want those documents in your inbox, floating around in an email. This is an industry, unfortunately, where we still transact a lot of information that is confidential as PDF attachments on emails. And, it's changing little by little. But if your client is going to send you proof of funds, please ask them to black out the bank account and all the sensitive information before they send that to you. And on the listing side, you do have the right to ask for that. It's called proof of funds. And again, it only needs to have the amount that they said. If they said 10,000, it only needs to have the 10,000, right? So you're correct. All right.
I kind of have a little bit of question, the same as Michael. So I'm actually in a current situation where listing agent sent me a form that the buyer should provide the name of the bank, this and that. And what my buyer did, he just took a screenshot of his account that it shows that yes, it's his name and available funds. Will that be sufficient to send to a listing agent, or I actually have to go into full length to fill up that form?
No, that's enough.
Okay.
Yeah, because again, the only thing that you have to prove is that they have that money sitting in a bank account. So,
Hi, Virginia. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question also about the same term. So assume if a listing agent is asking for those information, then the buyer agent can direct the listing agent to ask for a lender, but lender can also reject to answer this question. Am I right?
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And again, the lender has all this information and they are much more knowledgeable about the financial position of the buyer than you are. So I know that, part of being a real estate agent is that you feel like a superhero and you want to help your clients. Sometimes less is more, right? Again, same example as that final walkthrough. If you're like, oh, don't worry, I'll do it for you, don't. Right? Don't.
Okay.
And here this is, oh, it's a wonderful buyer. You actually don't know that, right? The buyer is telling you that, but you didn't ask for any information. You did not pre-qualify that buyer. So just channel them to the lender, and they will be able to provide all the information that they can release to that listing agent.
Okay, so for your suggestion, we always choose it's not authorized here, right?
Well, I have been in cases where I actually have put here the selling company is not authorized, and I have had listing agents push back at me, and they are like, "Why are you putting that you are not authorized to disclose this information to me?" And my answer is like, "I actually don't have any information to disclose to you. Call the lender, right?" It says basically the selling company, which is you, is not authorized to disclose to the listing company or to the seller or any lender any financial information that you have. So
Okay.
if you don't have the information, you have nothing to provide. So I have put here not authorized plenty of times. And when the listing agent calls me and they're like, why are you putting no? I'm like, I actually don't have any information. So call the lender. And that's it. It's a clean exit. You don't get in trouble. And everybody understands kind of like what is your limitation in terms of the contract.
Virginia, one quick question. So from all this conversation, it brings me to thought, sometimes lender want to include the buyer's agent on kind of what's happening and asking the buyer to provide XYZ documents. So it brings me to the conclusion that I should stay away from all that discussion, right?
Yes. And remember, you're representing the best interest of your client, right? So let's say that your client is in the middle of getting a gift from their parents to complete the down payment, right? And you're monitoring all this conversation between the lender and the buyer, and they're like, yeah, I'm waiting for my mom to send me this money, but she hasn't sent it, but she's sending it. And then the listing agent calls you and they say, how is the loan application going? Right? Like, do you want to disclose that they are in the middle of this conversation? No, you don't, right? That's not protecting your client's best interest. If there is something significant, for example, if the buyer lost the job yesterday, well, now that's a material information, right, that you are required to disclose. But when it comes to the finances, less is more. The only thing that you need to know is that buyer has a pre-qualification letter for $600,000 and that they can buy a $600,000 home. That's all you need to know, right? Where the money is coming from, who's providing the money, you don't need to know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Wood destroying insects, remember, it's more than termites. So that's why we call them wood destroying insects and not termites, right? So again, this happens all the time, right? They are like, well, we found evidence of termite, right? So read the contract so you understand the obligations, right? Buyer at buyer's expense may choose to obtain a wood destroying insect inspection of the property by a licensed pest control firm. If buyer elects to do so, buyer will furnish to seller a written report from the licensed pest control firm showing that all dwellings and/or garages within the property are free of visible evidence of any live wood-destroying insects. So what happens? And free from visible wood-destroying insect damage. Any treatment for live wood-destroying insects or repairs for damage recommended by the pest control company will be made at seller's expense. The treatment shall be completed by a licensed pest control firm, and repairs shall be completed by a contractor licensed in the appropriate jurisdiction. Seller will provide written evidence of such treatment and repairs prior to settlement. Okay, so let's walk through the mechanics. Buyer pays for the inspection. Okay, the inspection comes back. If the inspector says, I found dead termites, does the seller have to do anything? No, right? It says live or damage. It doesn't say anything about dead termites. So, and again, it happens all the time, right? So if there is live termites, or if they recommend any treatment, then the seller is responsible to pay for this and have the job completed prior to closing. So if they say, oh yeah, I pay for it, but they cannot make it until the day after closing, no. And again, this is really important because remember, the lender will not approve the loan if this is not done. The lender has an interest in the property, and they are not going to approve the loan if this treatment is not completed prior to settlement, okay? So you as the buyer's agent need to make sure that if there is any treatment or any repairs that need to be done, that they actually are done prior to settlement.
A quick question.
Yes, Afi.
So in case of an as-is contract, the seller still has to perform the treatment?
Well, when we look at the addendum of clauses, you will see that there is a provision in the as-is on whether the wood-destroying insects is required or not. So it depends on what the buyer and seller agree on that section.
Okay.
And I'll show that to you at the end. Lead-based paint. So if the property is built prior to 1978, the lead-based paint disclosure, both the jurisdictional and the federal, are required. And this, again, it's a new house. Only the basement is pre-existing. Well, if the basement that was pre-existing was built prior to 1978, then the lead-based paint is required, okay? It's just a portion of the basement, right? It doesn't matter. This is a black or white answer. If there is any part of the house that still stands, that was built prior to 1978, even if it's a corner of the house, this is required. If the seller tells you that they are not required, that's not true. If there is a portion of the house, can be big or small, that is standing and was built prior to 1978, the disclosures are required. Financing application. This contract is contingent on financing. Buyer will make written application for the specified financing. Here is the first time, right, that we hear that term. For those of you that have not heard it before, here it is. For the specified financing, and any lender require property insurance no later than 7 days. What happens? The settlement gets delayed, right? And the listing agent gets upset, and they call the lender and they say, why are you not approving this loan? And the lender says, well, I only got the documents from the buyer yesterday. Well, your buyer is in default. Why? Because your buyer did not submit all the lender required documents 7 days after ratification. So the financing contingency is not going to protect you, okay? So that's why it's very important that you read the contract and you understand the contract. Your client has to provide all the information to the lender within 7 days after ratification, okay? And again, it's for the specified financing. If you're going to change the financing, make sure that you change that in the documents. Damage or loss, the risk of damage or loss to property by fire, force majeure, and other casualties remains with the seller until execution and delivery of the deed of conveyance to buyer at settlement. So if the seller signs today, but the closing is tomorrow, and then something happens tonight, the seller is going to be like, I already signed. I signed yesterday. Well, Mr. Seller, not so fast, right? The day of closing is tomorrow, and you are responsible for everything that happens to the property until the deed is executed, which means signed by everybody and delivered of the deed of conveyance to the buyer at settlement. Okay. Title, there is a lot of issues that happen with the title. So I'm just going to give you, I recommend that you read this whole thing. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to tell you the most important things. Okay. Title has to convey free and clear. It has to be a marketable title. Okay. So marketable title means that it can be transferred from the seller to the buyer free and clear of any liens and any clouds on title. So for example, when you hear that there is a cloud on title, it means that something is attached to the title that does not allow for a free conveyance to that title to the buyer. It could be HVAC company put a lien on the property. It could be a dispute between two siblings on an estate, right? It could be a lot of things. When the title company does the title search, if the property shows any clouds on the title, only two things can happen. One, that cloud has to be cleared before closing. So again, you have to pay that HVAC contractor, right? Whatever needs to happen. You need to clear that before the title can convey to the buyer, or the buyer has to agree to take the property with a title exception. A title exception says, I see something here in the title that most likely we're not going to be able to clear before closing. And the buyer says, I'm okay. You can give an exception to the title, and I'm going to take the title with exception. What happens when you take exception on a title is that title insurance most likely is either not going to protect you, or it's only going to protect you with a caveat that that portion is not protected. So the title underwriter is going to say, well, I'm going to give you title insurance except for this issue that we found, this defect that we found on the title, okay? But in 99% of the cases, by the time you go to closing, the title company has checked the title and says the title can convey free and clear of any liens and any clouds, okay? So title insurance protects that title and the ownership of the property moving forward for those those buyers that request title insurance. I get that question all the time. Should I pay for title insurance or not? I always say it's totally up to you, right? You cannot force a client to get title insurance. If they do, it's a one-time thing that you pay, and it protects you during the home ownership. So 10 years down the road, somebody knocks on the door and says, my grandma told me that this house was going to be left to me. I'm the owner of the house. You have to get out. Then if you have title insurance, you say, listen, I have title insurance. I'm going to pass this to the attorneys, and they are going to take it from here. If you don't have title insurance, you're exposed, right? And you're going to have to seek legal counsel and pay for that legal counsel to defend you. So it's totally up to the buyer, but you have to be able to explain the risk and benefits. Not you, like you can give a big overview like what I just did, but you can direct them to the title attorney, and the title attorney can explain in more details the pros and cons. But the thing that you need to know here is that if the title company clears you to go to closing, is because the title is clear of any liens and clouds. And if there is an issue, there are only two ways to resolve it. Either you solve it prior to closing, or you convey the property with a cloud, and then the title insurance will have that exception. Any questions on title? Okay.
Virginia, I have a question. What's the difference between a LLC buyer or individual buyer regarding the title insurance?
What is the difference between what?
LLC buyer. So, you know, as a buyer, it can be LLC, but it can also be owner of LLC. So what's the pros and cons for these two different conditions?
So the title insurance protects the property from any future claims. It doesn't matter if the owner of that insurance is an LLC or an individual.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. All right,
Quick
possession.
question. I have a quick
Yes.
question, I'm sorry, about loss. That was prior to this one, prior to title. I wanted to know, so if, let's say, for instance, the buyer is signing all the document, the deed is being transferred to the buyer while the property is caught in fire, who is gonna be responsible for for the loss? Is it the seller or the buyer? If the buyer is being actually signing the document while, the damages are occurring on the property. So I'd
Yeah.
like to know that.
Yeah, I mean, the way this would play out is, let's say that you were at closing and the house caught fire, right? And then the police comes and writes a report and says, the property got fire at 3:15 p.m., right? And then the title company says, well, Afi, you signed the documents at 4:30. So remember, it's execution and delivery. So at 3:15, the seller was still the owner of the property. Or you finish signing at 3 p.m. and the fire started at 3:15, then unfortunately it's you.
Okay.
So it is going to be based on kind of like a police report or when the actual damage took place.
Can I make a suggestion, Virginia?
Yes?
With one of my closings, the attorney insisted that we have the binder of the insurance company, of the buyer's insurance, before he signed for the buyer. And that was helpful because you're insured from the moment you're the owner.
Yeah, absolutely. So the lender is going to require that you have homeowner's insurance effective the day of closing. So as a best practice, the seller should have insurance up to the day of closing, let's say midnight today, February 4th, until midnight. If I'm the seller, my insurance policy covers me until midnight, even if closing is at 3 p.m., right? And the buyer takes insurance beginning at 12:01 today. So technically, there are two insurance companies insuring the property today, right? I have the seller's insurance and the buyer's insurance. If something happens, the issue is that the insurance company is going to say, well, it's not me, because at that point you didn't own the property, right? So you have two insurances, but it doesn't mean that that the property is double covered, right? It doesn't mean that. It means that depending on the time of the day, either this one will pay or this one will pay, but both people have insurance that day. All right, possession date. Unless otherwise agreed to in writing between the parties, seller will give possession to the property at settlement, including delivering the keys, fobs, codes, if any. If seller fails to do so and occupies the property beyond settlement, seller will be a tenant in sufferance of buyer and expressly waives all notices to quit as provided by law. The way this plays out is that the seller is not ready to move out of the house and they still have a few boxes and they are like, oh, can I come at 5 p.m. to remove the last box? My recommendation is no. You can put your boxes in your neighbor's house. You can do whatever you need, but no, because again, a lot of things can happen, right? You need to give them access. They might damage the property. So if you are on the listing side, my recommendation is you tell your seller to move the day before, even though they have the right to occupy the property up to the moment of closing. As a best practice, if you're on the listing side, tell them to move out the day before and, tell the buyer that, at that final walkthrough, remember the property has to be free and clear of any debris, trash, and broom clean. So It happens all the time that the sellers have stuff in the house and they're like, oh, yeah, I'll come to it later, or just put it on the trash. That's actually not the buyer's responsibility, right? So if that happens, you as the buyer's agent can say, hey, I'll bring my handyman and remove that bookshelf that they left, or you have to help that buyer figure that out. Fees, basically, it talks about how the fees are paid and who's paying for what fees. Brokerage compensation. Remember, after the NAR settlement in 2020, what was it, 23? Now the listing agent, when they sign their listing agreement, they are going to agree with the seller in what is their compensation for them as the listing agent. And they are going to ask the seller, are you interested in providing any compensation to the buyer's agent? And the seller is going to respond one of three things: yes, no, or depends on what the contract looks like, okay? If they say yes, in the listing agreement, they are going to state what that compensation to the buyer's agent is. If they say no, or it depends, there is not going to be anything written in there. The listing agent has a notice that they can put out. If the seller said yes, the listing agent has a notice that they can put out as part of the disclosures saying, hey, everybody, the seller agreed to provide this compensation to the buyer's agent, okay? Or if they said no, or maybe, you're not going to see that notice. Remember, one thing are notices and the other things are addendums, okay? If in the disclosure you see a notice of the seller paying buyer agent compensation, that does not guarantee that you're going to get paid. You need to include the addendum for seller to pay buyer's agent compensation. So one thing is the notice, the other one is the addendum. The notice goes into the disclosures. The addendum has to make it into the contract. If there is a notice and there is no addendum, you're not going to get paid as the buyer's agent unless you had something in your buyer agency agreement and your buyer pays for that, okay? So be very careful with compensation because it changed after 2023. And you have to make sure that the seller's agreement to pay buyer's agent compensation addendum makes it into the contract, okay? If you have a buyer agency agreement, and the contract says something different, those two numbers need to match, or your buyer agency agreement. So all the numbers need to match somehow. Let's say that you said in your buyer agency agreement, I'm going to be paid 3 keys, right? Or 5 keys. And the seller says, well, I'm going to pay 4 keys. Then the buyer has to pay the other key. If the buyer is not going to pay the other key, then you have to amend your buyer agency agreement, okay? But all the numbers have to match between what the seller offer, what you have in your buyer agency agreement, and what makes it to the contract, okay? So we see a lot of problems with that. And, oh, the seller decided to offer more than what I had on my buyer agency agreement. Great. Go back and modify your buyer agency agreement because they have to match, okay? And the reason why that is important is because you don't want to have a buyer that says, I didn't understand that. I did not know you were going to be paid more. Like if I had known that the seller was willing to pay more, I would have asked the seller for a credit to me, the buyer, instead of that money going to you. I did not agree to that, right? I could have asked the seller to give me a higher concession. You and I had agreed that you were going to pay X, right? So again, if the number is going to be different, make sure that you modify your buyer agency agreement, okay? It's painful, it's not great, but that's the best practice.
While we are on that, I guess, compensation, what is a correct protocol between listing agent and a buyer's agent? I was in a situation where I had, I don't know if way more or slightly more what the buyer's agent actually asked and received. But when the papers came out, she sent me a kind of a very angry text saying, "Oh wow, next time at least have a courtesy to let me know how much you are going to be compensated."
And your answer has to be, I actually don't have to do that. I'm sorry, right? So I think that this is a very we can spend hours talking about this, but prior to the NAR lawsuit, right? The expectation was that the listing agent negotiated the commission for both ends, right? The listing agent, and you pre-negotiated on behalf of the buyer's agent. There was also, some sort of like expectation that those numbers were going to look pretty similar. That's not how free markets work, right? The seller can agree to different numbers, and the numbers can be very different. And at the end of the day, each party is responsible for negotiating with their clients. So my answer would have been, what did you negotiate with your client, right? Because you only get paid what you negotiated with your client, right?
Exactly.
And you put it back on her and say, hey, like, I'm not having this conversation with you, right? You're being paid what you negotiated. If you're upset, take a class to become a better negotiator, right? Like, that's on you, right? But that's not on me. I negotiated my commission. So agents that were doing a lot of business prior to the NAR lawsuit still have some of that language, and some of that, they still carry a little bit of that. Don't engage in any conversation like that. Don't fall for it. Don't feel bad. Again, your answer is only one. What did you negotiate with your client? That's why you get paid. Oh, but what did you negotiate with your client? That's why you get paid. And you just like almost like a robot, right? That's your sentence. Because if you say anything different than that, the one that is going to get in trouble is you. So be very careful with that language. All right. All these are kind of like disclosures in terms of what happens when disputes arise, right? In the event of a dispute between seller and broker, buyer, broker, resulting in broker or any agents of agents, employees are made party to a dispute, including but not limited to any litigation, arbitration, complaints. Seller and buyer jointly and severally agree to identify and hold broker and any agents harmless of any liability. So basically, this is carving out that the disputes at the end of the day are between a buyer and a seller. They are the only two parties in a transaction. They are the only two ones signing the contract, and they are putting the agents kind of like away from any disputes. If you have the tendency to use a language, again, we see ourselves as superheroes, right? So we use this language like we, and when you talk about we, it's you and the seller or you and the buyer. Well, we want to, there is no we. Take that language away from your brain completely, like not even a little bit, right? Take it away. There is no we. Unless you are a buyer and you're signing that contract and you're buying that property with your client, there is no we. My client wants, my client says, it is in my client's best interest. The seller, right? Change your language. Don't use we, because you're not buying the property and you're not selling the property. It's not yours. You're a real estate agent facilitating a transaction between a buyer and a seller. If you talk about we, again, when I'm on the receiving end of that we, I always say, is that you talking or is that your client talking? Because you don't make decisions, right? Your client is the one making decisions. So be very careful with that language. Legal expenses, performance, seller responsibility, default. Parties agree to perform at settlement in accordance with the terms of the contract. Failure to do so constitutes a breach thereof, right? What are the biggest causes of default? The buyer didn't send the EMD. You missed the home inspection deadline. There is no agreement between what is going to be done in terms of repairs. The appraisal comes in low. The buyer didn't get financing. All those are reasons why you end up in default. as a best practice, the more that you are ahead of these conversations, the easier it is not to be in default. I would say 99% of the buyers and the sellers are reasonable, right? If you say, hey, we had a problem with a bank account, the seller needs, 2 more days to be able to close, we need to extend closing. In 99% of the cases, the seller is going to say, fine. There is that 2% or 1% in which the seller is like, no, I actually need the money that day because I'm moving to a new house, right? So the earlier that you have those conversations, the better. As a best practice in the industry, because it's a small industry and we all know each other, when you feel that your client is not fulfilling a part of the contract, come with a resolution, right? So, for example, you could say, hey, listen, we need another week to extend closing. Would the seller be willing to do that? If they say no, you say, would it change their mind if we offer a per diem of, let's say, $150 per day of delay, right? Try to come with solutions that make the other party feel that you are acting in good faith and you're looking for a win-win resolution. Because, the seller might say, well, if you're going to give me another $1,000, right, and that will cover 2 nights of a hotel stay, sure, I'm going to agree to extend the settlement date. So the sooner that you have those conversations, the better, because leaving everything to the last minute is the worst idea. We see it all the time, especially with the financing, that the financing contingency the date comes and goes and nobody knows what's happening with the loan, and then you need to be extending, or you need to, you're like, well, the financing contingency automatically extends and I'm not in default. Working through those mechanics is very difficult versus agreeing something in writing in advance before the problem comes, right? So talk to your broker, and we have language to make sure that every single case of something that could happen is addressed, and just write a general addendum. Buyer and seller agree that this is going to happen next, right? That was not part of the contract, and this is going to happen next. If everything fails and one of the parties ends up being in default, it is important that the defaulting party, understands the legal implications, right? If they are in default and they fail to release the deposit, they are going to be liable potentially for court expenses and attorney's fees. So if they say, well, I know that I'm in default, but I'm not signing that release of deposit, well, great. You need to read this paragraph and you need to understand the potential implications of that, right? So if seller or buyer refuse to execute a release of deposit when requested to do so in writing, and a court finds that such party should have executed the release, the party who refused to execute the release will pay the expenses, including, without limitation, reasonable legal fees incurred by the other party in the litigation, right? So again, we see a lot of buyers that say, well, I know that I'm in default, but I'm not signing the release. And unfortunately, a lot of times the sellers say, well, it's fine. I don't want to go through the trouble of going to court. I'm just going to release the buyer. And the buyer might get lucky, but not every seller is like that, right? So they need to understand the potential implications. So make sure that your clients read and understand this default paragraph, okay? Property condition, here it specifies what property condition means, legal requirement, financing. So all this is for you to read and become familiar. I want to go through 2 things, right? The foreign investment tax, FIRPA. So basically, if a person is not required to pay taxes in the United States, they are subject to what is called FIRPA, okay? And what happens with FIRPA is that it's not necessarily a problem when you buy the property, it's a problem when you sell the property, okay? And the way it works is that the IRS is going to withhold, right, a portion of the sales proceeds unless you have completed all the FIRPA paperwork, and that money basically is either not withhold or is withheld and then comes back to you. So I'm not going to go into the details, but this applies to anybody working at embassies, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, kind of like those organizations where people have this kind of like diplomatic or semi-diplomatic status, and they are not required to pay taxes, okay? Definitions, please read this portion when you are doing a real estate transaction in DC and understand it, because unfortunately, Maryland, DC, and Virginia have 3 totally different timeframes, deadlines, and definitions, right? So in DC, days are calendar days unless otherwise specified in the contract. So if you have 3 days to review condo documents and they gave them to you on Friday, it's Saturday, Sunday, Monday, right? It's 3 days, it's calendar days. Unless specified. If it says business days, then it's Monday to Friday. But if it doesn't say business days, if it only says days, it's actually calendar days. For the purpose of computing time periods, the first day will be the day following delivery, right? So remember, when you ratify a contract, if you're the last party signing the contract, like your buyer signed today, if you did not deliver that to the other party, today is not the day of ratification, right? You have to deliver. So if you deliver tomorrow, tomorrow is day 0. Day 1 will be the day after tomorrow. So remember, it's after delivery, okay? And the time period ends at 6 p.m., not 9, not midnight, 6 p.m. So it's really important because we do a lot of transactions in different jurisdictions. I was talking to a very seasoned agent yesterday, and she was totally thrown off because she was doing a transaction in Virginia. And in Virginia, the negotiation period, if it says 3 days, it's not 3 days for one party to respond to the other. It's 3 days to do all the back and forth, right? Like you respond to me, I respond to you, and we have 3 days to figure all that out. In DC, you have 3 days. Then I have 3 days. Then you have 3 days, right? It's very different. So make sure that you understand the nuances of that. When it comes to condo documents, homeowners association, condominium, cooperative, first day will be the day following delivery, and the time period will end at 11:59:59 of the day specified in the appropriate addendum. So even within the same contract, right, for some things it's 6 p.m. and for some things it's midnight. So make sure that you read this and understand this, okay? If settlement date falls on a Saturday or a Sunday or legal holiday, then settlement will be the prior business day, not the day after. If you made a mistake and you said closing was going to be on a Sunday, it doesn't mean, oh, well, we'll close on Monday. No, it's actually Friday, okay? Date of ratification, the contract shall be deemed ratified when the contract, all addenda and modifications have been signed, initialed by all parties, and delivered. Again, your client signed, you're like, we're ratified. No, you're not. Until you deliver that to the other party, you're not ratified, right? So delivery is really important, okay? Specify financing, here is my favorite term, right? Means the financing set forth in the financing addendum, okay? Not what you think, not what your client think, is what actually was written, okay? More on delivery, miscellaneous, void contract, and entire agreement. So buyer and seller sign, the last person signing puts the date of ratification, and then, as we said before, you have to deliver this to the other party. And again, even if they are going to sign here, remember that you also have the initials at the bottom. So a lot of people sign here and then miss the initials, right? And then you send it to your compliance department and they send it back to you because you need those initials. All right, that was a lot. Questions?
I have one question. If you can go back when the property conveys, I think you said as is and broom clean. I had a situation where I said it's as is, However, so it's been pretty clean except in the garage. There were a couple of cans of paint and a few carton boxes. But again, it was specified as is. But then the buyer agent kind of said, well, I paid for these to take out, so please reimburse me. And I was kind of confused. So when you do as is, what type of document form do you provide that is actually as is? And I mean, in my understanding was you kind of see, you get what you see. But at the end, she said, well, please reimburse me for this. So I discarded all this garbage that was left at the garage.
Yeah, and I'm trying to pull the document. Give me 1 second. So normally, again, one thing is what people say, and the other thing is what makes it into the contract. And nothing is valid unless it makes it into the contract. So if in Bright MLS you say property conveys as is, that's great, but it still needs to make it into the contract, okay? So I'm going to show you kind of like where that goes. Share my screen. So in the addendum of clauses A, sorry that my computer is a little slow. Put it differently. Okay, so in the addendum of clauses, there is a section where it says, you know, as is clauses, and there are 4 options. One, the property conveys, you know, the wood destroying sections does not apply, or the broom and clean section does not apply. Okay, so now it's loading. Okay, so let's go over the addendum of clauses really quickly. So here you're going to put when the contract was dated, buyer and seller, property address. If there is a seller credit to the buyer, it will go in here, either a dollar amount or a percentage. This is not your compensation. This is going to the buyer directly, okay? Inspection notice. Let's say that you're going to reserve the right to do an inspection and you have 7 days. In DC, you have the option to click whether you want the right to negotiate or the right to cancel. If you don't put neither one of them, failure of either party to, what does it say? Select option, A or B or both. Failure to select either A or B will result in both being selected, okay? So if you click on one, it's only that one. If you click on the other one, it's that one. But if you don't click neither one of them, then it's both, okay? So right to negotiate gives you the opportunity to negotiate repairs. Right to cancel, you don't negotiate repairs, you only void if you want to void. And here is the additional as-is provisions. So remember, this is addendum of clauses A, and you're going to use this if you see any indication anywhere that the property conveys as is. All clauses pertaining to deliver the property free and clear of trash and debris and broom clean are deleted. So this means that the seller can leave things in the house, okay? All clauses pertaining to termites and wood destroying insects are deleted. And this happens a lot with foreclosures, like take the house as is, we're not going to do any wood destroying insect treatment or anything. All clauses pertaining to well and septic are deleted. All requirements for seller to comply with order or notices of violation of condominium associations are deleted, right? So for example, if you're in a homeowners association and it's a townhouse and there is a violation because they painted the door the wrong color, if you click on this and it's as is, now the seller is not required to fix that door before closing, okay? So this is where you have your 4 provisions. If you click here, you still have to click here, okay? So the following terms in the contract are hereby amended. Check all that apply. So if you click here, don't leave these blanks, because maybe you say, well, I'm only going to use these two, right? Not all of them. So make sure that you include all of them, okay? Rate on contingency. If the property is subject to rate on, it will go in here. This is for holding deposit check. Escrow agent shall hold deposit check until X number of days after verification, at which time the check shall be deposited. Again, not a best practice, right? Like that money should be available right away. License relationship disclosure. If anybody's related to the buyer or to the seller in any particular way, you disclose it in here. This is really important if somebody has an interest in ownership on an LLC, especially you as an agent. So if you're buying a property with your mom, your sister, and you guys are creating an LLC, you have to disclose this. And the way that you will disclose it, you say Virginia CarGov, a license affiliated with Keller Williams, check all that apply, and buyer and seller, right, are related to one of the parties in the following way. And then you say buyer agent or listing agent has an interest ownership in the purchasing entity. Okay, you have an interest ownership, you're part of the LLC purchasing the property. Additional provisions. This is used when, for example, you want to give somebody a deadline, right? The contract becomes null and this offer becomes null and void at midnight, February 4th. If the seller doesn't respond, right, you are automatically carving out time for the offer to expire. I just want to cover, I know that we're past the time, but I just want to cover two things very, very quickly. One is the condominium disclosure that Rodrigo had requested, and the conventional financing. And then we're also going to cover compensation, just to make sure that you guys understand that piece. So conventional financing, obviously there is a different document if it's FHA, but assuming that we're using the conventional financing addendum, this is where you're going to specify the financing that you're using, right? So the contract dated on this date, the information, and then here you say the following loans will be a specified financing. So this is what we're saying is our specified financing. Not everything else becomes alternate financing, and this contingency does not protect you in alternate financing. So buyer will obtain a first deed of trust in the amount of 95% over, let's say, 30 years at fixed or adjustable, so fixed. And then here is where all things go wrong, right? People leave it blank, they put a number, they don't know what to put. As a best practice, I would say put between 5 and 7, for example, right? Between 5 and 7%. So if my buyer gets 6.25, we're good. If the buyer gets 6.99, we're good. Put a range, because again, people are going to hold your feet to the fire with the information that you put in here, right? So put a range, don't leave it blank, don't put just one number, because then you're exposing your buyer, but you have to have something in here, right? So best practice, put a reasonable range.
And then market rate.
Yeah, I mean, you could, but technically, I mean, the way the contract is written is you have to put a number, but you could put market rate. Most people will accept that.
If we put a 5 to 7, assume that when the buyer has locked the interest, but the interest has already raised up to like a 7.5, then do you think the buyer can quit the contract because of this?
Yeah. Well, and remember, you can amend this after you go under contract, right? But it's important that any changes make it into the contract, because if not, you're not going to be protected with the contingency. The other piece that is important is, this addendum is going to be good for a lender, the same lender that issued the pre-approval letter, or a lender to whom buyer will make a written application within 7 days. So if your buyer is not sure that they will use the same lender that they use for the pre-qualification letter, then mark this one, please. Okay? Only mark this one if you are 100% sure that it's going to be the same lender. Okay? This is new. This was not there in the financing contingency before. So for people that, oh yeah, I know the GCAR contract, you have to be constantly reading these documents because they change, okay? Seller option to void the contract. Again, this is where it all goes wrong, right? Buyer shall deliver by 6 p.m., let's say 21 days, after contract ratification, a conditional commitment for financing from lender. The conditional commitment shall include any outstanding conditions after initial underwriter review, such as final underwriting requirements, blah, blah, blah. Following the financing deadline, but not until buyer delivers the conditional commitment to seller, the financing contingency will continue, and seller may deliver notice to buyer declaring this contract void. This is really important, and it's different in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. So in DC, after the financing deadline has passed, so the deadline ends today, but I haven't sent you the commitment letter, the contingency continues, okay? The buyer is still protected. If you're on the listing side, on day 22, you say, hey, Mr. Seller, the buyer, the contingency expired yesterday, and the buyer did not send us the final commitment letter. Do you want to declare do you want to deliver notice, right? And the seller might say, well, no, let's give them a couple of days. Or they might say, oh yeah, because I have somebody else wanting to buy my house, right? But if you're on the listing side, don't assume that the contingency expired, right? The contingency continues until the buyer, the seller delivers notice if they choose to do so. Now, upon delivery of the conditional commitment letter, the financing contingency will continue, and seller may no longer deliver notice declaring the contract void under the financing contingency until the settlement date has passed. So if the buyer delivers that commitment letter, now the seller cannot all of a sudden declare the contract void because the buyer already did what they were supposed to do. So if the seller wants to change their mind, they have to wait until the settlement date, right? If the buyer doesn't close on time, okay? If settlement does not occur on or before the settlement date and the financing contingency has not been removed and the buyer is not in default, settlement may occur anytime thereafter. However, once the settlement date has passed and until settlement has been completed, seller may deliver notice declaring this contract void. And this happens all the time, so please be careful, okay?
Excuse me, Virginia, is that only for conventional or is that across the board?
This is on the conventional addendum.
Okay.
Okay, you have to be careful because the FHA works a little bit different.
Right. Okay.
But what happens is I get a call from somebody and say, you know, the buyer, closing was yesterday and the buyer didn't close. And, you know, they are going to get a denial letter. I'm like, well, did you declare the contract void? No. If the buyer sends you that denial letter, now you don't have a recourse to go after the deposit, right? Because you didn't declare the contract void before that happened. So it's really important that when you're on the listing side, you are kind of like keeping a tempo with your client saying, hey, this has not happened. Do you want to deliver notice? This has not happened. Do you want to deliver notice? But if you did not do it during those last few days, the day of closing, if the buyer has not closed, you have to deliver that notice in order to have any claim on the deposit. You have to deliver notice. You have to say the party declaring, sending the notice is the seller, and you're delivering notice that the buyer is in default because they did not close today by 5 p.m. You send that notice to void at 5:05. You need to have it ready. You need to send it. Because if they send you the denial letter before you declare the contract void, they are still protected. Okay, so be very careful. Financing rejection, buyer may deliver notice declaring the contract void if buyer receives a written rejection from a specified financing from lender and delivers a copy to the written rejection letter. Again, if they do this before you declare the contract void, they are protected, right? Even if the 21 days have passed. So be very careful, okay? Removal of the contingency at any time prior to seller delivering notice declaring the contract void, buyer may remove this contingency by delivering the seller evidence of their ability to complete financing. If the buyer removes the financing contingency but fails to complete settlement by the settlement date for any reason not permitted in the contract, and as a result of any default, then the provisions of the default contract apply. And again, if you get to this point, that's when, engage your broker. And if things are hitting out, you might actually recommend to your client to seek legal counsel because, things can take a turn for the worse very quickly. But this is a good time to engage your broker and say, hey, I need help with this, okay? Appraisal contingency is pretty straightforward, but this is where you would include, like, you're having 14 days to do an appraisal under the conventional financing. Bear with me. I want to show you two more things, or actually, I think only one more thing. Okay, this one. Addendum for seller to pay buyer compensation. Okay, so remember, you could be in a situation where two things have happened. Either the seller provided a notice saying, hey guys, I'm willing to give this to the buyer's agent, or they are silent and they have not said anything. In either of those cases, you still need this addendum. A notice is not going to hold the seller feet to the fire, right? Like, the seller could have provided a notice, but if you don't have this addendum, you're not going to be paid by the seller, right? So this is how you get paid by the seller. You add this addendum for seller to pay buyer broker compensation. So the contract dated on this day between buyer and seller for this property, and then you choose one of these three options. Seller agrees to pay buyer broker compensation equal to a percentage, a flat number, or a combination of a percentage at a flat number. This is signed by the seller and the buyer. So if you put in here, remember, you're not signing this. Your client is signing this. So if the seller said, I'm going to pay to the buyer's agent 1 chicken, right? And then you have here 1 chicken, and the buyer says, okay, great, you're being paid 1 chicken. You're like, well, remember our buyer agency agreement said that I was going to be paid 7 chickens. The seller is only paying 1. You, Mr. Buyer, are responsible for the other 6, right? So all these documents have to be consistent. The seller can pay whatever they want. One thing is the notice, the other one is the addendum that makes it into the contract, and this number may match your buyer agency agreement or may not match your buyer agency agreement. And it's up to you to have that conversation.
Can I ask you a question? Because I'm having an issue right now. I think those two documents are linked. So if I put 100% on the BA, it actually transfers over here. So I went back and forth and I changed this to 50%, then went back over to the BA, was 50%. So how can we work around that?
Yeah, I'll show you. That's an issue with DocuSign, and that's kind of like a little glitch with DocuSign. So I'll show you how to fix that. But that's only for KWCP agents that are using this form that is linked.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So again, if you're expecting the seller to pay any portion of your commission, make sure this form is included. And oh yeah, Rodrigo, let me show you very quickly the condominium. When you request the condo documents, it's really important that you tell your clients that they have to review the condo documents. You don't have to review the condo documents, right? Because what happens is the buyer is going to say, well, you are the expert. I don't know what I'm looking for. And you could say, listen, I don't have a problem kind of like giving you kind of like a brief overview of what I see on the budget or on the research, but it's your responsibility. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a financial executive, right? Like this is not on me, because you don't want the buyer coming back to you later on and saying, well, you didn't tell me that the building didn't have enough reserves, right? That's for the buyer to discover. And the only job that you have to do is conveying all those questions from the buyer to the seller or to the management association. So don't take on that liability. Don't say to your clients, oh yeah, I'll review the condo documents for you. Don't do that, okay? That's for them to do. So you put the name of the association. Again, this is the seller completing this, okay? So they are going to put the name of the association, and they are going to say current fees and assessments. Regular fee, parking, storage, a special assessment. if you put something here, you have to complete B below. B, a special assessment. Potential buyer are hereby advised that there is or there is not a special assessment included in the condominium fee or separately paid. If applicable, please complete 1 to 4. Reason for the assessment, payment schedule, how much for how long, number of payments remaining. Maybe the seller has paid 3 of these and there are 6 left, right? Total special assessment balance remaining. And a lot of times the seller will say, well, I'll pay this before closing. So when you inherit the property, the assessment has been paid. This happens a lot for capital campaigns that the buildings need, like balconies, elevators, the boiler, right? It could be anything. The seller has to disclose if they are delinquent on any fees, right? And they also have to disclose if they have any knowledge of future increases. This did not exist before. So before, the way that this was written is, this is what I'm paying today, and this is if I have a special assessment. And the lawsuits, what happened was that there were special assessments coming up, and the buyer said, well, nobody told me that there was a $10,000 special assessment coming. Had I known that, I would not have bought the unit. And the seller was, I don't have to disclose that. I was only required to disclose current assessments, not future assessments. So they changed the form, and now you have D, future assessments that you are aware of. If seller is aware of any future assessments, then they have to complete this section. Are you aware? Yes or no? Okay. So that's a very important change that was just made very recently that is going to be very helpful for people buying in condominiums. And again, here, remember that example that I told you at the beginning? You know, is parking a parking space included? And if it is, or it is not separately taxed. If it is separately taxed, what is the lot number, square, and all the information? If it's included, then it's the same lot and square number. Name and contact information of the management company, and instructions for the resale package, okay? So you have to make sure that your client reads and understands that. The top portion is signed by the seller as part of the initial disclosures. Then your client, when you're making the offer, and once your client has reviewed this, your client signs off on the resale addendum. So your client signs this, and then after your client signs here, then the seller has to go back and sign one more time here, okay? So that's the best practice. All right, that was a lot. Questions? I think that my recommendation is read the contract when you don't have a buyer waiting for you, right? Because what happens is people don't read the contract, and then they have to write a contract and they panic and they are like, I don't know what to do. Go through all these documents, read them, ask questions, think about, you know, if I'm the listing agent, how would I see this document? If I'm the buyer's agent, how would I see this document? But, you know, become familiar with the documents before you actually have a client. We always say we don't practice on paid customers, right? So the time to practice is not when you actually have a buyer, right? Do it now, do it this weekend, print all the documents, take them home, you know, grab your coffee or your tea and read through them and make sure that you understand everything.
Can I ask a quick question regarding solar panel? So is that, I know there's an addendum for solar panel, but what kind of questions should we ask the seller, the listing agent, when it comes to solar panel?
So there is a solar panel addendum. So if there is a solar panel in the property, that addendum has to be completed, okay? And if you don't see it in the disclosures, make sure that you include it, okay? There are two issues with solar panels. One is who pays for kind of like the monthly installments, right? If the seller has paid for that, or if the seller is assuming that the buyer is going to inherit that contract. And the second one is, you know, if you're going to remove the panels prior to closing, making sure that the roof is in the same condition or in decent condition, because sometimes when they remove the panels, they damage the roof. So be very careful with a solar panel addendum.
Virginia, what type of documents do you need if the solar panel has been paid, inspection has been done, and determined that they are not fully functioning? Is seller bearing any responsibility?
Potentially, but you have to sue the seller, right? To make them accountable. So my recommendation is, if you see a solar panel addendum, there will be a name of a company listed there. Call them. Have the buyer call them directly and say, hey, listen, I'm thinking about buying this property on 123 Main Street. The seller is telling me this. Can you tell me what I need to know about this contract? Because the seller might have a different interpretation. And when you call the company is like, oh, no, that's not how it works, right? So always, 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 as a best practice, if you're buying a house that has a solar panel, always call the company and say, hey, can you walk me through this contract? What is the policy if I want to remove them, right? Sometimes the solar panel company will charge you to remove them, right? So the seller will say, oh, no, don't worry, they will remove them for free. And maybe the seller believes that. But then when you call the company, they are like, well, we would have removed them for free if they were the solar panels from 2003. But because they are from 2005, it's not, the removal is not included, right? There are always the little things that you don't know. So always call the company and cross-reference the information.
Sometimes they are leased too, so it's not necessary for purchased. Sometimes it can be leased by the owner.
Yeah. And Mona, you had a question? Is Mona gone? Okay.
Thank you, Virginia.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Sorry that we did not get to cover TOPA, but happy to answer any questions about TOPA. Just call me or email me. TOPA is, a whole topic in itself. And as you know, it changed before for single family homes and properties under 4 units. So I will be more than happy to do a one-on-one consultation on TOPA with anybody that is interested.
Thank you, Virginia.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.